Hey again, everybody. Welcome back to Speaking of Sundara, a series that I've been doing for Azukail Games to sort of talk about my Sundara Dawn of a New Age RPG setting for Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and Pathfinder Classic. And I figured that I'd like to make this video as kind of a follow-up to the one I made last week when I was talking about the Prim. And for those who haven't seen it, you should go watch it. But the short version is that the major purpose of the Prim is that it exists as the realm from whence all magic comes. So whether you're a cleric, a sorcerer, a wizard, a druid, any spellcaster, you draw your power from the Prim. The Prim is also the sort of spirit world to, contrast the material where the adventures take place. And it operates kind of as a simpler, more fluid form of the multiverse that we're used to having with 9 to 12 different planes of existence that we're always hopping back and forth through. But it has another purpose, and I mentioned it previously in my other video, that's it's also where all the gods dwell. And I sort of wanted to expand on that this week because I like to think that what the direction I chose for the gods in Sundara ended up being a lot more interesting than what we see in a lot of fantasy RPGs, and that might just be ego talking, but listen to me run it out and see if you agree. Maybe check out the book if it's the thing you want to see. But before we get into that, so when we normally play a fantasy RPG, we're given sort of a standard set pantheon for whatever the world is. It's just the general gods that you have in the cleric section. There's usually between 9 and 12, something like that. That'll just be the most common gods found throughout the setting. And then as the setting goes on and we get more material and we have more adventures and different writers add their own flair and touch to it, we'll come across other cultures that have their own religions and their own spiritualities. We'll find elven gods that, weren't really important until now, or we'll find dwarven gods who we might have seen one or two, but now we get the rest of their mythos. We'll find, halflings have their own gods, and gnomes have their own gods, and we'll find ancient giant gods that have been nearly forgotten, or we'll find dragon gods that are only worshipped in certain corners of the setting but will become prominent due to meta reasons. And each one of them has their mythology presented in such a way that it's taken not just as gospel, but as a history of the world. Of the mythologies of these fantasy faiths are truth as far as the settings are concerned. So all of them have to kind of fit together to explain the creation myth of the story and the great deeds done by the ancient heroes and all of that. It can sprawl out and get very complicated as we go on. And I thought about that when I sat down to make my own new setting, and I decided I was going to go in a completely different direction with it. And that was part of why I created the Prim and why it exists as it does, is I wanted religion in the setting to feel like you had to have faith in it, like it wasn't a fact. And I'll get to that in a moment as to how I did that. But examples usually work better than just long run-out prose. So there are two particular faiths that I use an example in Gods of Sundara for those who haven't gotten that book. One of them is a warrior cult up in the far northern hills of barbarians with great swords, and they have their great god Grimnir with his black sword that is death and his hooded gaze that no one ever sees unless they are to meet their maker that day. And then hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, in just the jungles of the deep south, you have these clans of lizard folk, and they pay homage to Sithras, who is this huge black dragon with breath that emanates, straight from the underworld, and a bite that is doom to any who take it. Both of these are manifestations of the same deity. Each of them is how these different cultures interpret Charn, the god of war. And that was sort of a mechanic I'd never seen played with before. I'd seen it done as game master interpretation. I'd seen it done as a story beat from a player. It turns out that, the particular fringe faith they had wasn't true, or it was part of an older, different cult and they were being lied to by an outsider, something like that. But in Sundara, deities are cosmic creatures. So it's humans, or just mortals in general, can't really perceive the truth of them without cracking something in their minds. There's just too much. They don't even exist in 3 dimensions, much less deal with things like gender or sex or death. These are things they're just beyond. They embody concepts and ideas, And different cultures and different creatures are going to interpret those things differently. So you'll have the core concept of a deity that is very similar across cultures, but the religions that spring up around them and the stories they tell about them and the interpretations they have of their wants and the cults that form around them are vastly different. And there are sometimes, particularly if you have a god like Charn, who is more interested in conflict than he is in, well, they, like I said, gender, is more interested in just battle. They're not going to stop a holy war between two factions. They want to see which one's stronger. They're going to let them fight it out. And that can be just one of those things that I felt made divine casters specifically, and just faith-based characters in general, less of wizards with habits, if you want to call it that way, is when you have arcane casters, they know precisely where their magic comes from. Whether it's a wizard knows this formula, it's a tested formula, it works every single time. It's like science with a robe. If you're a sorcerer, it's more of an art form, but you understand where the magic comes from, how you're shaping it, all of those things. But because so often mythology is taken as fact in a fantasy setting, it can kind of feel transactional. It's like your cleric, they don't really need faith because they know for a fact that this god is not only real, but they exist precisely the way they've been told they exist. And I've always felt that kind of took something away from the divine casters, because it feels like less of a risk when you're praying to something that has been confirmed. It's there. It's just asking, the middle manager to give you power so that you can do the thing in their name. Whereas what I wanted to do was sort of introduce genuine mystery to it. Have that moment of, is this thing you're praying to what you think it is? Does it have other names? Does it have other forms? How close are you to understanding what it truly is? And the closer you get, will you be able to come back and explain it to other people? And it might sound a little bit pretentious, because it sort of is. But it's the best way to understand it is kind of, the allegory of the cave of, you have your normal mortals who are looking at the shadows on the wall, and those are the myths taught by the various faiths. And yet they make sense. You can sort of see where they're getting the ideas and the interpretations, and the stories work. But clerics are sort of the people who have come away from the shadows, and they've realized there's more behind them, and they know there's something outside. And the more powerful they get, the closer they get to their deities in question, the closer they are to seeing the sun. But once they've seen it, they can't just go back in and tell people about it. They're going to sound like a mad person. And so they sort of have that question of, do you keep explaining your faith and this deity and what they want through the metaphors that people who can't see it and can't understand it can comprehend? Or do you try to bring them closer to the truth and possibly risk more? It's one of the reasons that, at least in my mind, divine casters are looked upon with a bit of suspicion by a lot of people, because there's no way to really tell what they're praying to and where their power is actually coming from. But there is a flip side to this of sometimes you do have the standard, I believe it was 10 deities I created for Gods of Sundara, and each of them has different faces, like I mentioned with Charn and those two separate cults. And there's sample faces throughout the book for each deity, just spitballing for people who don't just want to have the standard template for all of their clerics and all of their churches everywhere. But you can, and I encourage both game masters and players to do this, if none of the deities I presented really fit for the theme you want for your game or what you're trying to do going forward for your character, you should feel like you can create your own deity. You can make your own god. And it won't contradict any of that world mythology, because while lots of it's written down and lots of people believe it, very little of it is actually factually correct. It's metaphor. There are discussions of when the ancient gods formed the world, but they didn't come down and kneel in the rivers and form the mountains with their hands. Those are just the best way to explain to people who can't really grasp that level of power how it functioned. But so there is going to be that sort of back and forth of, you, the player, might know that this minor deity that you and your game master have made is exactly what they say they are. Of it's a minor god that was forgotten and has found you, and it's small enough that you can still like comprehend it, and it functions enough to give you power. But you might also have that thing you want to do with your character of like, now I want to be part of this fringe cult. And it turns out that this is just one of the many faces of this other god who's actually worshipped by another member of the party, but in a different form. And that could be something you want to play with going forward, of the two of you realizing that you've actually been following the same deity all along. But that's just sort of a more involved, if slightly rambly, take on what I've been trying to do with just the divine in general in Sundara going forward. And if that's the sort of thing people would like, or they want me to expand on it with future just splat books, of you want to have cults of Sundara, and I could just do selections of minor deities that cover areas that weren't in the original book, or if you want me to do different cults with detailed oaths and examples, throw it in the comments, toss some ideas at me, and we'll see what I can come up with. And as always, if you have any topics I haven't covered yet or something you want to know about the setting, then just feel free to leave a comment. Let me know. Get involved. All right. Happy gaming, everybody. See you next time.